Even though the seedless vascular plants have many adaptations that help them survive without external water better than the bryophytes or the non-vascular plants, they're still limited in many ways to moist areas. And that is because of their reproduction. So bryophytes, as you maybe remember, required water for their sperm to swim to the egg. And that requirement still exists for the seedless vascular plants. So ferns and horsetails and the Lycopodiophyta, they all are going to require external water for the sperm to travel to the egg. And so that's why you don't find these plants living in really dry climates. However, if fertilization does occur in the seedless vascular plants, the lycophytes and the pteridophytes are capable of producing lots more spores. That's because they have a bigger sporophyte generation. So they actually have a sporophyte dominant life cycle. That means the sporophyte is the one that's photosynthetic, and it's the gametophytes that are temporary and dependent on the sporophytes. And so the sporophyte is very large, it's long-lived, and it's the thing that produces spores. Bigger sporophyte, more spores. When you're looking at fern or Lycopodiophyta, what you see, the adult plant, is the sporophyte. So they produce the large, complex, branching adult plant. So this is the pteridophyte life cycle. And so these life cycle images are always kind of overwhelming. So I like to start by just reminding you that we have spores that go through mitosis and produce a gametophyte. And the gametophyte will produce gametes, either egg or sperm. And remember, this is not through meiosis. The gametophyte makes the gametes through a maturation process because it's already haploid. So the gametophyte is haploid, the egg and sperm are haploid, the spores are haploid. So the egg and the sperm are being formed within the gametophyte tissue, or in the gametophyte tissue. The egg is actually inside of the gametophyte tissue. Remember, it's held in the archegonia. The sperm are produced in antheridia. So that part is pretty much all the same as in the bryophytes. The sperm has to swim to the egg, and if it does, fertilization occurs. And let me just show my little sperm swimming over here. Remember, it has to have water, so let me put a little blue here. There's my drop of blue for the water. And if you get the fertilization, you get a diploid zygote. This diploid zygote then goes through mitosis and produces the sporophyte. And in the case of ferns, this is our big, big, big fern plant. Okay, and then at some point in some areas of the sporophyte, so they have sporangia. Okay, so in the sporangia of the sporophyte, meiosis will occur, and that meiosis will produce from the diploid sporophyte haploid spores. And so, whoops, let me go all the way over here. We're back where we started. Okay. So the advantage is that the sporophyte is very, very, very large. There can be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sporangia on one sporophyte. Therefore, it's able to produce lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring. Okay, so let's take a look at this figure now. A little more intimidating, but that's fine. It's still following this basic structure. I just want to remind you that this is what you return to, is this basic structure. Everything else is extra. Okay, so here's our spore. Remember, it's haploid. So it's released and goes out into the environment. If it finds a nice place to live, so not in your house, so a lot of people keep ferns in their house, and if you've ever had a fern in your house, you maybe have noticed it sometimes making a powdery dust off of its leaves. That was the spores, but you probably didn't notice any baby spores sprouting on your countertop or on your floor, and that's because they weren't favorable conditions. But if it reaches favorable conditions, it will initiate mitosis and grow into a gametophyte. So this is the gametophyte of a fern. So that it's these little green heart-shaped structures. They're really small. You really need a microscope to see them very well. And so they will start to form. Within the gametophyte, there are archegonia, that's the female gametangia, and you have male gametangia. Remember, that's the antheridia. And so the egg is formed inside of the female tissue, and sperm is released from male tissue. So here's male tissue, sperm being released from male tissue. The sperm have to swim over to the egg, and the egg again is inside of the tissue. And there's, after fertilization, there's our diploid zygote retained in the gametophyte tissue. So the sporophyte is going to start to grow out of that gametophyte tissue. And so it's going to suck nutrients from that gametophyte tissue, and that's what's happening here. There's a little tiny sporophyte. These are sometimes called fiddleheads when they get a little bit bigger. So some people actually eat them, or you can collect them in the wild. Like in the South, you can collect them in the wild. I think also in the North as well, actually, because I know somebody who grew up doing that, who was from Montana. So what happens as the sporophyte gets bigger is the gametophyte tissue dies. So this gametophyte tissue is dying, and this sporophyte is getting more and more independent. So at a certain point, that sporophyte becomes totally independent, and the gametophyte tissue is dead. And then that will grow into a new sporophyte, the new adult sporophyte plant. Okay, and then that plant will go about its business, carrying out photosynthesis, living its life. And then sometimes, and it depends on the type of fern, how often it does this, some of them do it all the time, some of them only do it occasionally. Some of the leaves do it, some of them don't. But what you'll get is these structures on the leaves called sori. The sori are structures that contain the sporangia. So inside of these sori, there are the sporangia. And the sori are visible to the naked eye. They're like these colored spots running along the leaf, and usually on the underside of the leaf, and then containing many sporangia. And so it's the sporangia that then cells inside of the sporangia go through meiosis to produce the spores. And we're back at the beginning. And so if you touch the sori, you'll get this powder on your hands, and that's the spores that are being released from the sporangia. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the life cycle of a fern. So vascular plants first appeared about 420 million years ago. This was during a time period in Earth's history called the Coal Age, or the Carboniferous Era. That's a reference to coal or to carbon resources like oil and gas, because during this time period, the plants were really robustly growing. There was a lot of CO2. It was warm and swampy on Earth over large stretches of Earth. So it was a very warm period in Earth's history. And the plants were absorbing CO2 through photosynthesis. So remember, they bring in through photosynthesis into their bodies. And then if they decay, the CO2 will be released back out. But if they don't decay, they hold that CO2 in their bodies. And what happened was their bodies got buried in layers and layers and layers of sediment and did not decay. And the pressure that happened, and all kinds of stuff I don't quite understand, to be honest, but pressure and the buildup of this turned the bodies of these plants and animals as well into fossil fuels. So the reason why fossil fuels are called fossil fuels is because they contain the remains of dead plants and animals. So, that's why there's a gas company that has a dinosaur as its symbol. Because again, fossil fuels really are the remains of bodies that did not decay. They're CO2 that was captured 400 million years ago. So as the plants did this, though, okay, so this was happening for a long time, but as they kept doing this, they pulled so much CO2 out of the atmosphere that it started to have a cooling effect on Earth's climate. And so the temperatures had been really warm, the earth had been warm and swampy. And then what happened was as the CO2 went down, so did the temperatures. So it got drier and cooler on earth. And so that change in the climate probably initiated the next sort of evolutionary step in plants, where plants that did better in cool, dry climates would start to become more abundant. And that's the gymnosperms that we'll talk about next. So when we look at sort of imagining what that early Earth was like, it would have had a bunch of these lycophytes and pteridophytes. So again, in this swampy, moist environment of Carboniferous era, the types of plants that did well were plants that liked moist conditions. And so I mentioned that the lycophytes today are really small and usually more like moss-sized, but at that period of time, we probably had almost tree-sized lycophytes. Ferns were gigantic. They were also tree-sized. And like the large regions of the globe were covered in swamps, so like including like Colorado, and so Colorado, I think it was a sea technically, not a swamp, but large areas were covered in water during that time period. And so this kind of shows the data that we have on CO2. So again, what we think is that before the Carboniferous era, so a longer time ago than the Carboniferous era, there was a lot of CO2, and it was warm and swampy. And then what happened was, due to that abundant plant growth that was happening, they gradually started to lower the CO2 because they were pulling it out of the environment so much. And so that would have led to a cooling of the climate following the Carboniferous era. In addition to affecting CO2 levels, we know that it makes sense that there was also really high oxygen produced by the plants. So oxygen at that time period was the highest we've ever seen. Because again, photosynthesis absorbs CO2, but it releases O2. And so after this period of abundant plant growth, again, it was a cooler, drier climate, and that probably led to changes in the types of plants that were around. So this period, the Carboniferous era, is when we have an abundance of seedless vascular plants. Remember, I mentioned that maybe a little bit before that, we had non-vascular plants that were starting to affect Earth's CO2 levels. And then what we see following the period of this big drop in CO2, so this is super low CO2 down here, is we start to see the rise of other types of plants like the gymnosperms. And so that's, again, how plants have influenced Earth's ecology, and especially early plants.